In the moonlit haze of the Caribbean Sea in the year 1718, where the whispers of ancient legends mingled with the salty spray of crashing waves, Captain Elias Thorne stood at the helm of his infamous ship, the Shadow's Fury, his weathered hands gripping the wheel as if it were the very thread of fate itself, his eyes piercing through the midnight darkness like daggers forged in the fires of forgotten battles. For he was no ordinary pirate, but a man haunted by a secret that could unravel the empires of old, a secret buried deep in the maps he had stolen from the Spanish galleons years ago, maps that spoke of a lost treasure not of gold or jewels but of something far more dangerous, a cursed artifact said to grant eternal life yet doom its possessor to endless torment. And as the clock struck 12 under the blood-red moon, the first cannon fire echoed across the waters, signaling the deadly battle that would test not just his crew's loyalty, but the very boundaries of reality itself, for lurking in the fog was the rival ship, the Crimson Ghost, captained by the enigmatic Lady Isolde Blackwood, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her ruthlessness, rumored to be the descendant of a long-lost Aztec priestess who had once wielded the same artifact. And as the two vessels closed in, their sails billowing like specters in the night, Elias felt a chill run down his spine. Not from the cold wind but from the knowledge that this encounter was no mere coincidence, for he had seen her face in his nightmares, whispering promises of revenge for a betrayal he could not remember. And with each boom of the guns, the seas seemed to come alive, waves rising unnaturally high as if the ocean itself was awakening to some ancient curse, pulling the ships closer into a dance of death where swords would clash and secrets would spill like blood on the deck. But little did Elias know that among his own crew was a traitor. A young cabin boy named Finn who had been planted by Isolde to steal the map fragment Elias guarded with his life. And as the battle raged, with pirates swinging from ropes and pistols firing in the chaos, Finn slipped below deck, his heart pounding as he approached the captain's quarters, the lock picking easily under his skilled fingers, revealing a chest bound in iron and etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim lantern light. Symbols that matched those in the old tales his grandmother had told him of gods and monsters from the deep. And just as he lifted the lid, a shadow fell over him, but it was not the captain, it was the ship's surgeon, old Doc Harlan, whose one eye gleamed with madness, for he too sought the artifact, having lost his family to the curse years before, and in that moment, a struggle ensued, knives flashing in the confined space, blood staining the wooden planks, while above, Elias parried a blow from one of Isolde's men, his sword singing through the air, but his mind raced back to the day he first found the map, in the ruins of a sunken temple off the coast of Jamaica, where he had dived into the abyss, lungs burning, only to emerge with the parchment that changed everything, promising power but delivering only paranoia. For every shadow now seemed to hide an enemy, every ally a potential foe, and as the Crimson Ghost rammed into the Shadow's Fury, wood splintering and men screaming, Isolde herself leaped aboard, her black cloak swirling like a storm cloud, her pistol aimed straight at Elias's heart, but instead of firing, she smiled, a mysterious curve of lips that held more questions than answers, saying in a voice like silk over steel, "You have something that belongs to me, Captain, and tonight, under this cursed moon, we shall see who truly commands the seas." And Elias, wiping blood from his brow, replied with a grin of his own, "The seas bow to no one, my lady, but perhaps they will drown us both before the dawn," igniting a duel that would echo through history blades, crossing in a flurry of sparks, each strike revealing glimpses of their shared past, for unbeknownst to either, they had once been lovers in a forgotten port, torn apart by the very treasure they now fought over, a treasure that legend claimed was hidden on an island that appeared only at midnight during the equinox, guarded by ghosts of pirates long dead. And as the fight intensified, with cannonballs tearing through sails and the decks slick with rain and blood, Finn emerged from below, the map in hand, but Doc Harlan lay dead behind him, a knife in his chest, and Finn's eyes widened as he saw the captains locked in combat, unsure of whom to betray, for Isolde had promised him riches, but Elias had saved his life once from a hanging in Port Royal, and in that hesitation, a massive wave crashed over the ships, separating the fighters and sending men overboard into the churning depths where shadows moved like living things, perhaps the guardians of the artifact stirring from their slumber, and Elias, clinging to the railing, shouted orders to his crew to fire the grapples and board the enemy vessel, determined to end this before the mystery consumed them all. But as his men charged, A fog thicker than any natural mist enveloped both ships, whispers filling the air, voices of the dead speaking in tongues long forgotten, and Isolde's laughter cut through it, chilling and triumphant, as if she knew something he did not. Something about the artifact's true power to bend time itself, allowing glimpses of futures where empires fell and pirates ruled eternal, and Elias felt a pull in his chest, as if the map was calling to him from Finn's hands, urging him to reclaim it before the boy could decide his fate. And in the midst of the chaos, a single shot rang out, not from a pistol but from a hidden sniper on the Crimson Ghost's mast, striking the mainmast of the Shadow's Fury, bringing it crashing down in a tangle of ropes and canvas, trapping several men beneath, including the loyal first mate Grimes, who had been with Elias since their days as privateers under the British flag, before they turned rogue in search of fortune. And as Grimes gasped his last breath, he whispered to Elias, "Beware the boy, Captain, he's not what he seems," planting a seed of doubt that blossomed into paranoia, for Elias now questioned every face around him, wondering if the curse had already begun, turning allies into enemies under the midnight sky, and with renewed fury. He charged toward Isolde once more, their swords meeting in a clash that sent vibrations up his arm, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that spoke of old wounds and unspoken desires, and she hissed, "You left me to die in that storm, Elias, but I survived, and now I'll take what's mine," revealing a fragment of their history that he had buried deep, a storm off the coast of Cuba where he thought she had perished. But clearly she had not, rising like a phoenix to haunt him, and as they dueled, the fog parted just enough to reveal the outline of a distant island, shimmering unnaturally in the moonlight, the very island from the legends, appearing as if summoned by the battle itself, and Elias realized this was no ordinary night, but one where destinies intertwined with the supernatural, where deadly battles at midnight could awaken forces better left asleep. And just as he disarmed Isolde, her sword flying into the sea, Finn stepped forward, map in hand, but instead of handing it over, he tore it in half, shouting, "This curse ends tonight!" only for a bolt of lightning to strike the deck, illuminating a horrifying truth. The artifact was not on the island, but hidden within the ship itself, in the chest Finn had opened, and as the light faded, shadows rose from the hold, ghostly figures of past pirates, their eyes glowing with unearthly fire, advancing on the living with skeletal hands outstretched, turning the battle from one of flesh and blood to a fight against the undead. And Elias, grabbing Isolde's arm in a moment of unlikely alliance, pulled her toward the wheel, yelling, "We must sail for the island before they consume us all!" But she resisted, her gaze fixed on the ghosts, recognizing one as her ancestor, the priestess who had cursed the artifact to protect it from greedy hands. And in that revelation, the mystery deepened, for the deadly battles at midnight were not just about treasure, but about breaking a cycle of eternal damnation that had plagued the seas for centuries. And as the ships drifted closer together in the unnatural current, bound by invisible forces, the crew fought back against the spectral invaders, swords passing through mist yet somehow wounding the apparitions, sparks of ectoplasm flying like blood, and Finn, regretting his tear of the map, pieced it back together with trembling hands, reading the ancient script that spoke of a ritual to banish the curse, requiring the blood of two rivals spilled under the midnight moon. And he rushed to tell Elias, but a ghost clutched at his throat, choking the words, leaving him gasping on the deck as the battle raged on, with Isolde now fighting alongside Elias, her pistol blasting at the undead, each shot echoing like thunder. And Elias wondered if this was the hook of fate, drawing them into a web of history where love, betrayal, and mystery collided in the heart of the storm. And as the first rays of false dawn threatened to break, the ghosts grew stronger, feeding on the darkness, forcing the captains to make a choice, unite or perish, in this suspenseful dance of pirates' deadly battles at midnight, where every shadow held a secret and every wave a grave. Continuing the tale into depths unknown, with the island looming larger, its beaches lined with the bones of those who had sought the artifact before, whispering warnings that went unheeded in the heat of combat, and Elias, slicing through a ghostly form, felt the weight of history on his shoulders, knowing that this part of the story was just the beginning. A hook to pull the reader deeper into the mystery that would unfold across the seas and through time itself. But for now, the fight continued, unrelenting and fierce, under the watchful eye of the cursed moon. Its crimson glow casting eerie shadows across the battered decks of the Shadow's Fury and the Crimson Ghost, Elias Thorne and Lady Isolde Blackwood stood back to back, their swords slashing through the spectral forms of long-dead pirates that surged from the hold like a tide of nightmares, their skeletal hands clawing at the living with an insatiable hunger for vengeance, while the sea roiled beneath them, waves crashing against the hulls with a fury that seemed to echo the ancient curse awakened by Finn's reckless tearing of the map, now hastily pieced together in his trembling hands as he crouched behind a barrel, the glowing symbols on the parchment pulsing like a heartbeat, whispering secrets of a ritual that could end the torment, but demanded a terrible price. And as Elias parried a ghostly cutlass, its blade passing through his own with a chilling hiss, he shouted to Isolde over the cacophony of cannon fire and unearthly wails. "We must reach the island before the dawn breaks, or we're all doomed." But her eyes, sharp as the edge of her blade, flickered with defiance, for she knew more than she let on, her ancestor's ghostly visage still lingering in her mind, the Aztec priestess who had bound the artifact to this curse centuries ago, and as she fired her pistol into the chest of a spectral figure, its form dissolving into mist, she replied, "The island is no sanctuary, Elias. It's a trap set by the dead." Yet the unnatural current pulling their ships toward that shimmering shore left them little choice, and the crew, battered but fierce, fought on, their loyalty to Elias tested by the terror of facing foes no mortal blade could truly slay, while Finn, his young face pale with fear, clutched the map tighter, its edges fraying as he deciphered more of its cryptic script. Realizing the ritual required not just the blood of rivals but a sacrifice of something far dearer, a truth he dared not share yet, for the ghosts were closing in, their hollow eyes fixed on him as if they sensed his role in this unfolding tragedy. And above, the sniper in the Crimson Ghost's crow's nest fired again, the shot grazing Elias's shoulder, drawing a line of blood that mingled with the rain-soaked deck, and he grunted, refusing to falter, his mind racing back to that stormy night off Cuba when he had left Isolde for dead. A memory now twisted by guilt and doubt, for her survival and return as his enemy felt like the work of fate or something darker, and as the ships groaned under the strain of the unnatural tide, their hulls grinding together, ropes snapping like brittle bones, Isolde spun to face him, her cloak billowing, and hissed, "You think you can outrun the past, Captain? The artifact knows your sins!" Her words cutting deeper than any blade, and Elias, deflecting another ghostly attack, countered, "And what of your sins, Isolde? What did you swear to your priestess kin to gain such power?" Their words a duel of their own, layered with the weight of their shared history, a love lost in the chaos of greed and ambition, and as the battle raged, the fog thickened, wrapping the ships in a suffocating embrace, the whispers of the dead growing louder, speaking of betrayals and promises broken, and Finn, dodging a spectral hand, scrambled toward the captain's quarters again, the chest within still open, its contents glowing with a sickly green light that pulsed in time with the map, revealing a small obsidian dagger etched with the same symbols, its blade sharp enough to cut through reality itself, and he hesitated, knowing that to wield it might seal his own fate. But the screams of the crew above spurred him on, and he grabbed it, tucking it into his belt as he raced back to the deck, where Elias and Isolde had carved a path through the ghosts, their movements synchronized in a way that betrayed their old bond. Though neither would admit it, and the island loomed closer now, its beaches glowing with an unnatural light, the bones of fallen pirates littering the shore like a warning carved in time, and Elias, wiping sweat and blood from his face, shouted to his crew to man the cannons, determined to blast a way through the spectral horde. But the powder was damp, the guns misfiring, and the ghosts pressed closer, their forms shifting between human and monstrous, some with faces of men Elias had sailed with years ago, men he had failed or betrayed in his quest for the artifact, and their accusing eyes bore into him, stirring a guilt he had long buried, while Isolde, her own blade flashing, fought with a ferocity that hid her fear, for she too saw faces in the mist, her family, her crew, all lost to the curse she had inherited, and she wondered if this battle was her punishment or her redemption. And as the ships neared the island's shore, the current suddenly reversed, pulling them back into the open sea, as if the ocean itself rejected their approach, and a new figure emerged from the fog, a ghostly captain clad in tattered Spanish regalia, his eyes burning with a fire that matched the artifact's glow, and he raised a hand, silencing the other specters, his voice booming like thunder. "None shall claim what was stolen from the gods!" And Elias, heart pounding, recognized him from the tales, a conquistador who had first unearthed the artifact, only to be consumed by its power, and now he stood as its eternal guardian, commanding the ghosts to swarm with renewed fury, and Finn, clutching the dagger, shouted to Elias. "The map speaks of blood and fire, Captain! We must burn the chest!" But Elias, locked in combat with the ghostly conquistador, could barely hear, his sword useless against the spectral foe, and Isolde, seeing the boy's desperation, grabbed a torch from a fallen crewman and fought her way to the hold, determined to destroy the artifact before it destroyed them all. But as she descended, the air grew heavy, the walls of the ship seeming to pulse with life, and she found the chest, its lid now shut, the symbols glowing brighter, almost singing, and she hesitated, the priestess's voice echoing in her mind, warning her that to destroy the artifact would unleash a greater evil, one that could swallow the seas entire. And above, Elias finally struck the conquistador, his blade passing through but drawing a wail that shook the ship, and for a moment, the ghosts retreated, giving the crew a chance to regroup. But Finn, still holding the map, realized the ritual's true cost. The blood of rivals meant not just Elias and Isolde, but himself, for he was tied to the artifact through his grandmother's tales, her bloodline linked to the priestess, and he froze, torn between duty and survival, as the sniper fired again, this time hitting a crewman beside Elias, who fell with a scream, and the captain roared, rallying his men to board the Crimson Ghost, determined to end Isolde's threat once and for all. But as they swung across on ropes, the fog parted, revealing the island again, now closer, its cliffs rising like jagged teeth. And the ghosts surged once more, their numbers endless, forcing Elias to retreat, pulling Isolde with him as they fell back to the shadow's fury, their alliance uneasy but necessary, and Finn, clutching the dagger and map, whispered to himself, "I can't let them die for this," and slipped below again, unnoticed in the chaos, determined to face the chest alone. But as he approached, the conquistador's ghost appeared before him, its voice a hiss. "You cannot break what was forged in sacrifice." And Finn, trembling, raised the dagger, its blade catching the light, and struck at the spectre, which dissolved with a scream. But the chest began to shake, the ship lurching as if struck by a giant hand, and above, Elias and Isolde fought side by side, their blades a blur, their past forgotten in the face of survival. But the sea grew wilder, waves towering over the masts, and the moon, still blood-red, seemed to pulse, as if counting down to some final reckoning, and Finn, now alone with the chest, felt the dagger grow warm in his hand, the map burning against his chest, and he knew the moment of truth was near, for the ritual demanded a choice: destroy the artifact and risk the world, or wield it and become its slave. And as the ghosts closed in, their whispers now a deafening roar, he made his decision, raising the dagger high, ready to plunge it into the chest. But a hand grabbed his wrist, Isolde, who had followed him, her eyes wide with fear and resolve, and she said, "Not yet. Boy, we need to know what we're unleashing." And together they turned to face the oncoming specters, the battle at midnight spiraling into a maelstrom of mystery and death, where every choice could damn or save them, and the island, now almost within reach, beckoned with promises of answers and doom, its shores alive with the restless dead. And as the shadow's fury and the crimson ghost were dragged closer by the unnatural tide, Elias felt a chill deeper than the sea wind, a weight not only of the battle raging around him but of every choice, every betrayal, every life taken in the name of glory or greed, pressing like an invisible anchor on his chest. And though he tried to steady his breath, the crimson glow of the cursed moon above made the air itself feel heavy, as if the sky was leaning down to crush them all, while Isolde, her dark hair plastered to her pale face by the mist and rain, stood near him with blades still bright from cutting through ghosts, her stance proud, her eyes fierce. Yet in those eyes a storm swirled that Elias recognized all too well, for he had seen that look once before when she had chosen vengeance over mercy. And though her pistol barked loud and her sword flashed sharp, her silence between strikes carried more weight than her voice. Because he knew she carried knowledge she refused to share, knowledge of the curse, of the priestess, of the artifact, secrets tied to her bloodline that she feared would turn ally against ally. And below deck Finn trembled, though he tried to hide it behind clenched teeth, clutching the glowing map so tight his knuckles whitened, the parchment seeming almost alive, pulsing with green fire like a living heart, while the obsidian dagger at his belt grew warm. as though it hungered for something only he could give, and in his young mind fear battled with duty, for he remembered his grandmother's tales, the way her voice had dropped when she spoke of the priestess who bound the artifact, how she warned that blood would always call to blood, and though he never believed then, the map's glow now proved the truth, and as cannon fire cracked the sky and ghostly shrieks rose like a choir of the damned, the two ships slammed against jagged reefs, with splintering, masts creaking, the sound like bones breaking under the weight of centuries. And men were thrown across the deck, some into the black waters where shadows moved like living chains, pulling them down screaming into silence. And yet Elias roared above it all, rallying his crew with a voice that refused to bend, shouting that they must push to shore or perish in the tide. And though terror clawed at them, the loyalty of sailors to their captain burned stronger, so they swung on ropes, jumped into boats, or leapt straight into the shallows, boots sinking into black water that seemed to resist each step, and still they pushed forward, swords raised, voices raw, while on the opposite side Isolde's crew followed her command, storming into the surf, their loyalty born not of love but of fear and respect, for Lady Blackwood had earned both in blood, and the two rival crews, though enemies, found themselves side by side on cursed sands, the sea roaring behind them, the fog curling around their ankles like smoke from an unseen fire, and the moment their feet pressed into the island's earth, the ground shifted, bones clattering underfoot as if the soil itself breathed with the dead, and from the tree-lean shapes began to stir, first as shadows, then as bodies long buried, skeletons wrapped in seaweed and rusted armor, conquistadors with tarnished helmets, pirates with broken cutlasses, their sockets burning with green fire, their mouths chanting words not meant for living ears. A rhythm older than the waves, and that chant grew louder, each step forward like a drumbeat that pounded against the hearts of the living, and even the bravest sailors faltered, yet Elias gritted his teeth and raised his sword, shouting to his men that they had faced storms, kings, and death itself and still survived, so they would not falter before bones and shadows, and Isolde's pistol cracked, the shot shattering the skull of the first skeleton that dared step from the mist, its bones scattering like dry leaves, though the fire in its eye sockets drifted back to the sand, glowing as if waiting to rise again, and then the rest surged forward, a tide of the dead meeting a line of the living on that cursed shore, and steel rang against bone, sparks flying, screams tearing the night, the crimson moon casting it all in the light of a dream turned nightmare, and in the center of it all Finn stumbled, clutching the map to his chest, watching men he had eaten with, laughed with, be cut down by skeletal claws, their souls snatched by the mist, and in his heart a terrible realization grew, that the ritual spoken on the map was not just instructions, it was prophecy, and every life lost was part of the cost, and though he wished to run, something deeper held him, the weight of destiny, the call of blood, and then, as if to confirm his fear, the mist parted at the tree-lean and a figure emerged, tall as a mast, robed in gold tarnished by centuries, its jaguar mask gleaming in the moonlight, its hand gripping a staff of obsidian that pulsed with the same green fire as the chest, and when it spoke its voice was not one but many, rolling like thunder across the beach. You who seek the bound heart, hear this. No treasure waits, only chains, for what was stolen from the gods may not be claimed by mortal hands. And its words shook the air, sending ripples across the sea, making even the ghosts fall silent for a breath, and in that silence Elias felt his courage waver, for he knew this was no ordinary specter but something far older, the very guardian of the curse, the conquistador twisted into eternal servitude, the priestess's binding made flesh, and as the figure raised its staff the ground split, bones erupting from the sand to form walls, trapping the crews on the beach, their ships groaning behind them as if dragged by invisible chains deeper into the reef, and the screams of drowning men carried through the fog, and Isolde, her blades still dripping with ghostly mist, stared at the figure with eyes that burned with something Elias could not read, fear, rage, recognition, and in a voice low enough only Elias heard she whispered, "It is her, the priestess, my bloodline's shadow." And before Elias could ask more the figure struck the ground with its staff, and a shockwave tore through the beach, hurling men into the air, snapping bones, dousing torches, and in the chaos Finn fell to his knees, the map glowing brighter, the dagger at his side searing his skin, and in that moment he knew, this was only the beginning, the true ritual was about to awaken, and the price was far greater than anyone was ready to pay. Yet the knight gave no pause, no chance to breathe, for as Finn knelt trembling with the glowing map pressed against his chest and the obsidian dagger burning at his side, the island itself seemed to draw a breath, the sand shifting underfoot as though it were flesh rather than soil, the tide roaring with a voice that was not of the sea but of countless whispers, the dead calling, the betrayed begging, the cursed mocking. And Elias staggered to his feet, his sword slick with salt and phantom blood, his eyes blazing though his limbs screamed with exhaustion, shouting for his men to rally, to form a line against the rising horde. But his words were swallowed by the crashing of waves and the cries of the dying, for the skeletons surged forward without fear, bones rattling, blades clashing, their hollow eyes fixed not only on flesh but on the boy clutching the map. As though they sensed in Finn the key to their release, and Isolde, dragging herself upright after the shockwave, fired shot after shot into the glowing sockets, her voice sharp as she cursed both the dead and the living, shouting that they were fools to fight shadows when the true battle lay within the heart of the island. And yet even as she spoke her hands trembled, for she saw not faceless spirits in the mist but her own kin, her mother, her uncles, her crew. All swallowed by the curse generations ago, their bony faces turned toward her, with eyes that accused and begged, and she fought harder, blade flashing, not to silence them but to silence her own guilt, while Elias, wiping blood from his brow, forced himself closer to Finn, knowing the boy carried more than he admitted, shouting above the chaos. "The map! What does it demand? Speak, boy!" But Finn shook his head wildly, fear choking his words, for how could he tell his captain that the script whispered of sacrifices no sane man would allow, that blood must be spilled not just of enemies but of bonds, of family, of chosen kin, and so he clutched the parchment tighter, muttering prayers to a god that had long since abandoned these waters, and the jaguar-masked figure at the tree-lean watched in silence, its staff glowing brighter with each heartbeat, the obsidian symbols pulsing like stars ready to collapse, and then it raised its arm, pointing the staff directly at Finn, and the ground trembled, bones erupting from the sand like spears, impaling men where they stood, tearing the line apart, screams ringing as sailors were lifted into the air and thrown like rag dolls into the tide, and Elias roared with rage, charging forward, his blade cutting down skeletons left and right, carving a path toward the towering figure, but for every strike he landed 3 more foes rose, until his arms ached and his breath came ragged, yet he did not stop, for he had lived too long with guilt to allow another boy to carry it in his place. And still the island pulled them deeper, every wave pushing them further onto its shore, every gust of wind driving them away from the sea as though escape no longer existed. And above, the crimson moon pulsed, brighter, heavier, its light no longer pale but thick, like blood dripping across the sky, and the fog coiled tighter, muffling the sounds of battle so that only the whispers of the dead remained, weaving into the ears of the living, taunting them with secrets, luring them with lies. Until sailors screamed at shadows that bore the faces of their lost wives, their lost children, their betrayed brothers, and in that madness men turned their blades on each other, some cutting down comrades as though they were phantoms, and laughter echoed through the mist, cruel and endless, and Isolde, seeing the unraveling, shouted for her crew to fall back, to form a circle, but her voice cracked when she saw one of her most trusted men, a scarred sailor who had been with her since her first voyage, stumble forward with eyes glowing green, his soul stolen, his body now nothing more than a puppet, and when he raised his rusted cutlass at her she hesitated for only a heartbeat before firing, the shot tearing through his skull, his body collapsing at her feet, and though her face remained steel, her heart cracked. For every death reminded her that she too might one day stand against Elias as nothing more than a puppet of the curse, and Elias, reaching Finn at last, grabbed the boy by the shoulders, shaking him hard, demanding he reveal the ritual's truth. But before Finn could answer, the staff of the jaguar-masked figure struck the ground again, and the earth split wide, a fissure yawning between them, glowing green light pouring from below as though the heart of the island itself was aflame, and from that chasm rose not skeletons but spirits, translucent forms of men and women from centuries past. Conquistadors, pirates, natives, priests, all bound by chains of light, their faces twisted with eternal pain, and they screamed in unison, a sound that shook the bones of every living soul, a sound that made even Elias stumble, clutching his ears, and Finn fell to the ground, the map slipping from his hands, the parchment unraveling as if alive, its symbols twisting into new shapes, revealing lines that had been hidden, words in a tongue he somehow understood. And as he read them aloud in a voice not his own, the world seemed to still, even the waves pausing. And the words burned through the air. Blood of rivals, blood of kin, bound to the stone where it begins, fire to cleanse, sacrifice to bind, what is lost to gods is lost to time. And when his voice ceased, the island groaned, trees bending, stones splitting, and the jaguar-masked figure laughed, a sound like thunder rolling through a graveyard, declaring, "So the air speaks! The cycle turns once more!" And Elias, hearing the words, turned pale, for he understood now what the map demanded, what the artifact required: his blood, Isolde's blood, and Finn's blood, all woven into the ritual, a triangle of sacrifice, rivals bound by fate. And as this truth settled like iron in his gut, he looked at Isolde, her face pale but her eyes still blazing, and for the first time in years he saw not an enemy, not a rival, not a ghost of his past, but the woman he once loved, and in that moment he hated the artifact more than he had ever hated a man, for it demanded not only death but the death of all bonds, of all hope. And Finn, trembling on the sand, reached for the map again, whispering through tears that perhaps there was another way, perhaps the dagger could cut the chain without the blood. But even as he said it, the blade at his side pulsed hotter, burning through cloth, branding his skin with the symbols of the priestess, marking him as chosen whether he willed it or not. And the sea roared again, waves crashing higher, spraying red under the cursed moon, and from the chasm the spirits surged, their chains whipping, lashing at the living, dragging men into the glow, their screams vanishing as their bodies turned to ash. And Elias raised his sword, standing tall though the weight of doom pressed harder, shouting to his men to hold, to fight, to give no inch. Even as he knew in his heart that no mortal steel could turn this tide, and still he fought side by side with Isolde, their blades crossing paths, their movements woven like old lovers dancing, though neither would admit the bond. And above them the jaguar mask glowed brighter, the staff raised high, the guardian's voice booming. "Choose, children of blood, or be swallowed whole, for dawn will break and the seas will drown in fire if the sacrifice is not made." And as those words echoed across the cursed island, Finn screamed, clutching the dagger with both hands, his small body shaking as he cried, "No! I won't let you decide for me. If blood is demanded, then it shall be mine, and mine alone." And he raised the blade high, ready to plunge it into his own chest, but Isolde, quicker than thought, lunged forward, grabbing his wrist, shouting through tears, "Not yet, boy. We need to know what we unleash. Once begun there is no return." And the three of them stood there, locked in the glow of the fissure, the screams of the dead rising around them, the choice heavier than the sea itself, while the crimson moon bled across the sky, its light counting down to an end none could yet imagine. And in that dreadful pause, where time itself seemed to stretch thin like a sail about to tear in the storm, every breath, every heartbeat became a world of its own. Elias staring at the boy's trembling hand with the dagger raised, Isolde clutching his wrist with desperate strength, her own heart beating so loud she thought it might shatter her ribs, and Finn's young face streaked with tears, eyes wide not only with fear but with something Elias had not expected: resolve, the kind of resolve born not of age but of bloodline, of destiny. And for the briefest of moments Elias remembered himself as a boy, younger than Finn, standing on a deck for the first time, salt stinging his eyes, a cutlass too heavy in his hand, and he thought of how fear and courage were never separate, how they were one and the same thing, and the memory broke him for just a heartbeat. But he pushed it down, for the present roared louder than the past, the fissure glowing brighter, the spirits surging higher, their chains lashing like whips across the battlefield, each strike cutting flesh without drawing blood, instead pulling pieces of the soul itself. And sailors screamed as their eyes went blank, their bodies crumbling into dust that fed the chasm's glow, and the jaguar-masked guardian lifted its staff once more, the obsidian tip burning so bright it hurt to look upon. And its voice carried across the island like thunder rolled into words. "The gods do not wait. The circle must close, the blood must fall, the offering must be made before dawn breaks, or the sea will rise to swallow all, and the curse shall become the world." And those words sank into every ear, twisting in the hearts of the sailors, making some fall to their knees in despair, making others turn their blades on each other as madness grew, for whispers filled the fog now, voices of lost lovers, voices of betrayed friends, voices of fathers and mothers, all speaking in tones too familiar, luring the men to ruin. And amidst this chaos Elias, Isolde, and Finn held their ground, though barely, their little triangle of defiance like a flickering flame in a storm that threatened to snuff it out. And Isolde, her face pale, her pistol empty, her blade heavy with the weight of ghosts she had cut down, looked into Finn's eyes and said in a voice that cracked though she tried to keep it steady, "Listen to me, child, you are not just a pawn, you are blood of the priestess, yes, but you are also more, you are choice, you are will, and that dagger does not command you, you command it." And Finn trembled, the heat of the obsidian eating into his skin, the glow of the map burning like fire pressed against his chest, and he stammered through his tears, "But it calls to me, lady, it calls to me like it knows my name, like it has always known me, and I am afraid that if I do not answer it, if I do not give what it demands, it will take me anyway." And Elias, standing tall though blood dripped down his arm and sweat soaked his brow, growled through clenched teeth, "Then damn it, boy, let it take me instead. I've lived with sins enough to fill a sea, let it feast on my blood and leave you be." But Isolde spun on him with fury, shouting above the storm, "And who are you to choose for us, Elias Thorn? You think only your guilt has value? You think only your sins count? No! This is bigger than you, bigger than me, bigger than all of us, and we cannot keep pretending we carry this alone." And her words cut through the roar like a blade, striking something deep in Elias, and for a heartbeat he faltered, lowering his sword, seeing not the cursed shore, not the glowing fisher, not the screaming dead, but the face of Isolde as she was long ago, younger, softer, when they had once dreamed of sailing together not as enemies but as partners, and in that fragile memory, the world felt almost human again. But the vision shattered as the fisher roared louder, flames of green and red surging into the sky, and the spirits screamed in unison, their chains lashing toward Finn, the guardian raising its staff to strike, and Elias threw himself forward, shielding the boy with his own body, the chains whipping into his flesh, burning deep, searing through muscle into soul, and he screamed as his vision went white, falling to one knee, the world tilting around him. And in that white void he saw visions, faces of every man he had betrayed, every sailor he had left behind, every crewman who had died for his ambition, all staring, all accusing, and among them the priestess herself, her eyes glowing like twin suns, her voice echoing, "Your sins are the mortar of this curse, Captain, your greed the hammer, your betrayal the fire, and yet you dare to think you can defy what was written in blood?" And Elias roared back at her in that void, I dare! For I am still alive, and you are nothing but shadow and ash!" And the vision shattered, his body crashing back to the sand, breath ragged, skin scorched with the marks of chains, and Finn crawled to him, screaming, "Captain? No, no, you can't leave me, you can't leave us!" But Elias pushed the boy away weakly, forcing a grin through bloody teeth, whispering, "I'll not fall yet, lad, not while the sea still hears my name." And Isolde, kneeling beside them both, her cloak torn, her hair wild, her eyes shining with fury and sorrow, whispered, "Then stand with me, Elias, for if we must fall, let us fall together, as once we swore." And he looked at her then, not as rival, not as ghost, but as the woman he had once loved, and he nodded, and they rose side by side, blades drawn, ready to face the guardian and the endless dead, while Finn, tears streaming, clutched the dagger tighter, his heart torn between the sacrifice demanded and the love he felt for the only family he had left. And as the crimson moon pulsed brighter, casting the entire island in a glow like burning blood, the guardian thundered once more, "The hour is nigh! Choose, or all will drown in fire!" And the ground shook so violently the ships behind them cracked apart, masts falling, sails burning with green flame, sailors screaming as the sea swallowed them, and the island itself began to rise, jagged cliffs climbing like teeth, the fissure widening into a chasm that split the beach, pulling men, ghosts, and bones alike into its maw. And Elias, Isolde, and Finn stood on the trembling edge, the dagger glowing, the map burning, the choice pressing down, like the weight of the world, and still they did not yield, though the storm above howled, though the sea below raged, though the dead themselves screamed for resolution. And in that endless moment of terror and defiance the story did not end. it only grew, spiraling deeper into the curse that bound them, deeper into the shadows of history, deeper into the truth of what was stolen from the gods and what price must be paid to return it. And as dawn's first light threatened to break beyond the crimson haze, the three souls stood at the edge of fate, knowing the next heartbeat would decide not just their lives, but the fate of the seas themselves. And as the crimson haze quivered with the first hint of dawn far on the horizon, the island groaned like a beast waking from centuries of slumber, the cliffs cracking, trees bending, the ground splitting wider so that fire and green light poured out in fountains of sparks. And the three stood at the trembling edge, their bodies battered, their minds torn, yet their wills bound together by something greater than blood or rivalry, for Elias felt in his bones that this boy, this woman, and himself were no longer three separate souls but one strand of fate braided by the hand of the curse itself. And though the thought chilled him, it also steeled him, for if he must fall, he would not fall alone. And while the guardian in the jaguar mask raised its staff higher, chanting words that carried like thunder and rattled the bones of every living man on the island, Finn's hands shook as the dagger pulsed brighter, searing his palm, whispering in a tongue he did not know yet somehow understood, telling him that sacrifice was the only key, that only blood could seal the rift. And he thought of his grandmother's stories, how she told him that their line had always been tied to the sea, that one day a child of their blood would be called to either end the curse or bind it forever. And now he knew she had not been warning him, but preparing him, and though he was only a boy, his heart swelled with a resolve older than his years, and yet Isolde would not release his wrist, her grip iron though her body trembled, and she cried out above the roar. "Do not listen, Finn! Blood has been the answer for centuries, and still the curse grows. We must break the pattern, not feed it." And Elias, though his lungs burned and his vision blurred from pain, growled in agreement, shouting, "Aye, she speaks true. This is no ritual of salvation, it is a chain, binding us again and again. There must be another way." But the guardian laughed, its voice booming like collapsing cliffs. "Fools! You cannot break what the gods themselves decreed. You cannot fight eternity with mortal hands." And it slammed the staff into the earth, sending another shockwave tearing through the beach, bones exploding upward like spears, impaling men who screamed as their souls were torn free and dragged into the chasm. And the crews of both ships, what few remained alive, shrieked in despair, some throwing down their weapons, others fleeing toward the sea though the waves rose like walls to hurl them back. And amidst this storm of terror Elias remembered faces, his first crew who had trusted him before greed stole his heart, the friend he had abandoned on the reefs of Havana, the brother he betrayed for a chest of silver, and guilt welled like poison, but with it came fury, a fire that burned hotter than fear, and he raised his sword though his arms shook, shouting at the guardian, "Then damn your gods! If eternity is chains, I will shatter them with my mortal hands!" And with a roar he charged, Isolde at his side, their blades flashing in the crimson light, cutting down skeletons that swarmed to block their path, each strike carving through bone and shadow, each step dragging them closer to the towering figure. And Finn stumbled after them, torn between terror and determination, clutching the map in one hand, the dagger in the other, the words of the ritual still burning in his head. But another voice now whispering beneath them, softer, gentler, the voice of his grandmother, telling him that power was never in the blood itself but in the choice of the one who carried it. And he clung to that hope even as the world tore itself apart around him, and the battle raged, the air filled with screams, the sky cracked with lightning, the earth shook with fury, and still Elias and Isolde pushed forward, side by side, their blades moving as one. And in those moments the years of betrayal seemed to burn away, leaving only what they once were and what they could have been. And Elias, between blows, shouted to her, "Do you still hate me, Isolde?" And she snarled back, "Always. But hate is not all I feel, and that is my curse." And her eyes flashed with tears even as she cut down another phantom, and Elias's heart twisted, for he knew then that whatever fate awaited them, love and hate had become the same chain between them, unbreakable. And at last they reached the base of the fissure where the guardian towered, its mask glowing, its staff blazing, and it raised its weapon to strike them down. But before it could, Finn leapt forward, holding the dagger high, shouting words he did not know but that poured from his lips like a tide, words that shook the very stones. And the fissure flared brighter, the spirits screamed louder, the guardian staggered, and for the first time it seemed to falter, its chains rattling, its form flickering, and it roared. "No! You are not the chosen boy, you are the vessel, you are the key, but you cannot be the lock!" And the dagger burned hotter, flames licking along its obsidian edge, and Finn screamed, not in fear but in defiance. "Then I will be both, I will be all, and I will end this curse even if it ends me." And he drove the blade into the ground, into the glowing heart of the fissure, and the island erupted with light, a blast so bright it turned night to day, so fierce it burned the eyes of all who saw. And the shockwave threw Elias and Isolde back, crashing into the sand, their ears ringing, their bodies broken, and for a moment the world seemed to vanish in light and silence. But then the sound returned, waves crashing, screams echoing, chains snapping, and they looked to see Finn standing at the center of the glow, the dagger buried deep in the earth, his body lifted by the force of the ritual, his eyes glowing like the priestess herself. And the guardian shrieked, its mask cracking, its form unraveling, spirits breaking free of their chains and rising into the sky with cries of sorrow and joy, and the island shook as if in agony, cliffs collapsing, trees burning, the sea rising higher, and Isolde crawled toward the boy, screaming his name, but the force pushed her back, flames licking at her hands, and Elias staggered to his feet, his voice raw as he bellowed, "Hold fast, lad! Do not give yourself to it!" But Finn turned his head, his young face calm now, almost serene, and he whispered words they barely heard. "It has to be someone, Captain! It has to end with me!" And as the light consumed him, the dagger pulsed one final time, the fissure snapping shut, the ground sealing, the guardian shattering into dust, its mask falling to the sand with a hollow thud, and the spirits faded into the dawn, their cries echoing into silence, and for a heartbeat the island was still. The sea calm, the crimson moon pale as it sank below the horizon, dawn breaking at last in streaks of gold across the sky. But on the sand lay only Elias and Isolde, broken, bleeding, staring at the place where the boy had stood, the place now marked only by the obsidian dagger half buried in the earth and the faint glow of the map's ashes. And the silence of that moment was heavier than all the screams before, heavier than all the battles, for they knew they had lost more than a comrade, more than a child. They had lost their last chance at redemption. Or perhaps found it, paid with the blood of one too young, and Elias fell to his knees, his sword slipping from his hand, his chest heaving with sobs he had not let free in years, and Isolde stood over him, her face pale, her hands trembling, her eyes empty of fire, for the first time she did not know whether they had won or lost, whether the curse was broken or only sleeping, waiting to rise again. And as the dawn warmed their faces, the island groaned once more, the sand shifting, the bones beneath stirring, and a low voice whispered from the earth, soft yet clear, "The circle is not broken, it is only begun." And both Elias and Isolde froze, their eyes wide, for they knew the battle was not yet over, that Finn's sacrifice was only the opening of another chapter. And as the sun rose higher, the shadows of the dead crept back toward the sea, waiting, watching, and the artifact's true heart still pulsed beneath the island, silent but alive. And so the tale stretched onward, deeper into doom, deeper into the seas of blood and memory, deeper into the endless war between mortals and the gods they defied, and the question of who would pay the final price lingered in the dawn like a blade unsheathed. The golden light of morning washing over the shattered beach, yet offering no comfort, for the silence that followed Finn's sacrifice was not the silence of peace but of something waiting, breathing beneath the earth, a silence like the pause before thunder strikes. And Elias Thorne stood with his sword hanging at his side, his shoulders sagging, his face pale, eyes fixed upon the dagger still half buried in the sand where Finn had vanished, and in that gaze was not triumph but a hollow grief, the kind of grief that came not from losing one battle but from realizing the war had no end. And beside him Isolde Blackwood swayed on her feet, her cloak torn, her pistol empty, her blade chipped from the endless clashes with bone and spirit, her dark hair plastered to her face with blood and sea spray, and yet her eyes burned, not with victory but with rage at fate itself, and she whispered under her breath, almost a prayer, almost a curse, "The sea takes, and the sea takes again, when will it give back?" And the only answer was the groan of the island, deep and guttural, as if the land itself resented the light of dawn, cracks widening in the cliffs, smoke and green mist seeping from the fissures, and though the guardian had fallen, its mask now shattered on the sand. The curse it had served was not gone but merely restless. Chained beneath their feet, whispering promises in voices that slithered into their ears like venom, and the crews that remained, what pitiful few had survived the night, staggered along the beach, their faces pale, their eyes hollow, some kneeling to weep for comrades lost, others staring at the rising sun as though it were a dream they could not touch, while a handful muttered prayers to saints or devils, begging for deliverance from this waking nightmare. Yet none dared step near the dagger, for they felt its pull, the way the sand around it seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, the way the air shimmered with heat though the dawn was cool, and Elias at last tore his eyes from it, forcing himself to breathe, his chest heaving like a bellows, and he turned to Isolde, voice hoarse. "This is not over, we are not free." And she laughed, a broken laugh, sharp and bitter. "Free? Did you ever believe we would be? We are bound as surely as he was, Elias, bound by blood, by sin, by the sea itself." And her words cut him deeper than any blade, for he could not deny them, and memory rose in him unbidden. His first voyage as captain, when the stars had seemed like guides instead of judges, when his heart had still been unburdened by betrayal, when Isolde had stood at his side not as rival but as companion, their laughter mingling on the wind, dreams as wide as the horizon, and how easily he had broken it, for silver and gold, for promises of power, and now he stood amid the bones of centuries, wondering if all captains before him had been lured the same way, if greed was not a choice but a curse in itself, woven into the very salt of the sea. And as he wrestled with these thoughts, a cry went up from the surviving sailors, a cry of terror, for from the waves came new shapes, wrecks long sunk rising to the surface, their hulls shattered, their sails in tatters, yet their decks crawling with skeletal forms, ghostly crews climbing from the sea as though summoned by the dawn, and their eyes glowed the same green fire as the fishers, their mouths opening in voiceless screams, and the men on the beach staggered back, clutching what weapons they had left though they knew steel could not save them, and Elias gritted his teeth, forcing strength back into his weary limbs, raising his sword, though even he felt the futility of it. And beside him Isolde lifted her pistol though no powder remained, her hands trembling yet her face defiant, and she spat toward the sea. "Come then, ghosts, if you wish to drag us down, you will choke on my blood first." And her courage sparked a fire in the men, thin though it was, and they drew up what formation they could, a ragged line of survivors facing the oncoming tide of death. But before the first clash could come, a sound echoed across the beach, not the howl of ghosts but the crack of wood and the groan of sails, and all turned to see a third ship emerging from the mist beyond the reef, a ship none had seen before, its sails black as tar, its hull carved with runes that glowed faintly in the dawn, and it cut through the waves with unnatural speed, the sea parting before it, and Elias felt his blood run cold, for he had heard whispers of such a vessel in ports long forgotten, a ship that sailed without crew, without flag, answering to no nation nor pirate king. A ship called only the Eternal, said to appear at the turning of great curses, to bear witness or to claim souls, and now it came straight toward the island, its sails full though no wind blew, its decks empty save for a single figure at the prow, cloaked in shadow, unmoving, and the ghosts in the waves seemed to hesitate, their glowing eyes turning toward the newcomer, their shrieks faltering, as though even they feared what approached, and Isolde's lips parted in shock, her voice a whisper. "No, not that, not now!" And Elias snapped his gaze to her, demanding, "You know this ship?" And her eyes met his, wide with dread, and she answered, "It is no ship, Elias, it is judgment." And as the Eternal drew nearer, the sea darkened beneath it, the very dawn dimming as though the sun itself recoiled, and the figure at its prow lifted its head, the shadow falling back to reveal a face not flesh nor bone but a skull wreathed in smoke, eyes burning like stars long dead, and when it spoke, its voice carried across sea and sand alike, echoing in every heart. "The circle is broken, yet the debt remains. The blood of the boy has bought you nothing but delay, and now the sea demands its due." And silence fell heavier than chains, the sailors trembling, some dropping their weapons, some falling to their knees, and Elias clenched his fists, shouting back across the waves, "Enough of riddles, Spectre! If debt remains, claim it from me, for it was I who sought the artifact, I who carried the map, I who led them all to this doom. Take me, and leave the rest." And his voice cracked with both rage and despair, For he meant it, truly meant it, though he had never meant sacrifice before. But the skull-faced figure only tilted its head, its burning eyes fixed not on Elias but on Isolde, and it said, "The sea does not bargain, Captain, it remembers, and it remembers her blood, her oath, her betrayal." And Isolde stiffened, her face pale, her lips trembling, and Elias turned to her, confusion and horror mingling, demanding, "What oath? What betrayal?" But she could not answer, for her throat closed with the weight of secrets too long carried, and in that silence the Eternal drew closer, its shadow falling upon the beach, stretching long and cold, and the bones of the dead rattled as if in salute, and the island shuddered again. And in that moment Elias knew that the battle was far from over, that Finn's sacrifice was but a spark in a storm that would rage far longer. And the true price had yet to be paid, though who among them would pay it he could not yet see, for the sea held its secrets still, and it whispered in the crashing waves, promising more blood, more chains, more nights of crimson moon before any dawn could truly break. And as the shadow of the eternal ship swallowed the beach, the survivors shivered as though winter itself had fallen upon them, their breath misting in the chill though the sun still rose, golden but dimmed, its warmth stolen by the presence of that cursed vessel. And Elias Thorne, captain though broken, staggered forward with his blade dragging in the sand, his eyes locked on the skull-faced figure at the prow. Yet his ears tuned to the silence of his crew, for not one of them dared breathe too loud, as though fearing the ship might notice them and claim their souls with a glance, and his heart pounded with both fear and fury, fear because no mortal man could stand against such a thing, fury because still the sea and its shades demanded payment, never satisfied, never sated, and he cried out again, voice raw, "If there is debt to be paid, let it end with me. Let the boy's sacrifice not be wasted." But the skull only grinned wider, its hollow sockets blazing, and it spoke not to Elias but to Isolde, its words like the tolling of a bell. "The boy's blood opened the path, but your oath, daughter of the priestess, still binds it shut, and until it is broken, the curse cannot end." And the men turned their eyes upon her, some with confusion, some with suspicion, some with fear, for they had sailed long with Lady Blackwood, but none had known she carried an oath older than their lives, and she herself trembled, her hands clenching into fists, her jaw tight, for she had long kept this truth buried, even from Elias. But now the sea had dragged it into light, and at last she whispered, voice cracking, I swore to guard the artifact, to protect it from those who would steal its power. I swore it to my ancestor, the priestess who bound it, and the sea itself heard me, and bound me with chains I cannot break." And Elias's eyes widened, his heart pounding, betrayal and pity warring within him. For he remembered all the times she had stood against him, all the battles fought between them, and he saw now it had never been mere rivalry, but duty, a duty she despised yet could not cast off, and he shouted, half in rage, half in anguish, "Why did you not tell me? Why hide it, Isolde? We might have fought this together, we might have found another way." And her face twisted with pain, tears brimming though she fought them, and she snapped back. "Because I knew you, Elias, knew your greed, your hunger, your lust for glory. You would not have sought to break the curse, you would have sought to wield it. I could not trust you then, and I do not know if I can trust you now." And her words struck him like cannon fire, and though he longed to deny them, he could not, for deep in his soul he remembered the truth of his past, the treasure taken, the lives betrayed, the love lost ambition, and he bowed his head, shame burning him hotter than the sun, and around them the men murmured, torn between their captain and the woman who claimed an oath older than all of them, their loyalties shaking like ships in storm. And then the Eternal's figure raised its bony hand, pointing at Isolde, and thunder rolled across the sea though the sky was clear, and it said, "Your blood, sworn to the sea, is the key, give it freely, and the chain may break, refuse, and all who stand upon this island shall drown in shadow." And the words sent ripples of fear through the men, some crying out for her to do it, others begging her not to, for they feared what new curse might rise if her blood fed the island. And Elias stepped between her and the ship, sword raised though he knew it would avail nothing, shouting, "You will not take her! She has paid enough, more than enough. If blood you demand, take mine, for I am the sinner here. I am the thief who sought what was never mine. I am the one who broke the world." And the Eternal's burning eyes turned to him, and for a moment it was silent, as if considering, and in that silence the sea grew still, the gulls ceased their cries, even the whispers of the dead hushed, until the figure spoke again, its tone colder than before. "You offer willingly, yet your blood is tainted, Captain, blackened by greed, soured by betrayal. It cannot cleanse, it can only stain, and the sea has no use for stains." And Elias fell to his knees, his sword slipping from his hand, despair crashing over him heavier than any wave, and Isolde, seeing him broken, felt her own chains tighten, and she clenched her fists, whispering to herself, "Always it comes to this, blood, always blood." And then louder, to the figure, she cried, "If my oath binds me, then let my blood free me, but know this, if I fall, my curse falls with me, and I will not go alone." And her eyes burned with defiance, her cloak snapping in the sea wind, and she drew a dagger from her belt, pressing the blade to her palm, ready to cut, ready to give. But before she could, a shout rang out from among the men, a voice high and desperate. "Wait! It need not be her!" And all turned to see a ragged sailor step forward, his clothes torn, his face hollow, his eyes wild, and he fell to his knees before the Eternal's shadow, crying, "Take me! Take me instead! I have no oath, no chain, no worth, take me and spare the rest!" And murmurs swept the beach, some cursing him for a coward's bargain, others whispering prayers, but the skull's eyes fixed upon him, and it let out a laugh like cracking ice. "One life willingly given is but a drop in the sea, yet even drops cause ripples." And it raised its hand, and the man screamed as his body twisted, his flesh dissolving into mist, his bones collapsing into the sand, his soul rising in green flame that was drawn into the Eternal's hull. And the ship groaned as if fed, its sails flaring brighter, and the figure hissed, "The debt is not paid, but the sea is patient, for now." And with that, the Eternal began to drift back into the mist, its shadow lifting, the chill fading, yet the dread remained, for they knew it would return, always return, until the oath was broken, until the sea was truly satisfied, and Elias rose unsteadily, staring after it, his voice a whisper. "This is not finished, it will never be finished." And Isolde dropped her dagger, her hands shaking, blood trickling from the shallow cut she had made, her heart heavy, and she whispered back, "Not until we end it, Elias, not until we face the sea itself." And as the Eternal vanished into the fog, the island groaned again, louder than before, and the ground beneath their feet cracked wider, and from the fissure rose not ghosts this time, but water, black, churning, endless, pouring upward as though the sea itself sought to swallow the land. And the men cried out, scrambling back, and Elias and Isolde locked eyes, understanding passing between them, that the island was sinking, dragged into the abyss by the very curse they had stirred, and there was no choice but to flee, to take what men remained and find their way back to the Shadow's fury and the Crimson Ghost, battered though they were, and try to escape before the island was lost to the waves forever. Yet even as they turned to run, the whispers of the dead rose once more, louder, clearer, speaking not in curses but in prophecy. "The sea remembers, the sea waits, the sea will claim what is owed." And those words followed them as they fled the collapsing beach, the sky darkening though the sun had risen, and in their hearts they knew the truth, that this battle was only the beginning, that the circle had not ended but widened, and that their choices, their sins, their oaths, would echo across the seas until the final debt was paid in blood, not of one, but of all who defied the sea's endless hunger. And even as those whispers chased them, Elias felt the ground quiver beneath his boots, the sand trembling like the breath of some sleeping giant that now stirred, and with a great roar the island began to split, cliffs collapsing into the sea, trees torn from the soil as if by unseen hands, bones of the ancient dead dragged down into the churning black water that poured from the fissure like a flood, and the men cried out in terror, their discipline broken, scattering across the beach in wild desperation, some running toward the shattered ships, others falling to their knees in prayer, while a few, mad with fear, rushed into the waves only to be pulled under by the dark current that seemed alive. And Elias roared above the chaos, his voice ragged but commanding, "To the ships, all of you! If you would live, to the ships!" And though many hesitated, his voice carried the force of a captain who would not be ignored, and so they stumbled and staggered after him, clinging to life as the world crumbled, and Isolde was at his side, her cloak torn, her face pale but her eyes fierce, dragging wounded men by their arms, shouting curses and orders in the same breath. For though she bore the weight of her oath, she still bore the heart of a leader, unwilling to abandon those who yet followed, and together they fought their way across the collapsing beach, sand giving way beneath their boots, cracks opening that spewed smoke and green fire, and still behind them the whispers rose, louder and louder, until they were nearly shouts, the voices of thousands of dead crying in unison. "The sea remembers, the sea waits, the sea will take you all!" And Elias felt those words claw into his soul, but he pressed on, his mind fixed on survival, though he knew deep within that escape was not salvation but only another delay, another reprieve granted by a curse that would never rest. And at last they reached the edge of the water, where the shadow's fury and the crimson ghost lay battered against the reef, their masts broken, their sails torn, their hulls leaking from cannon fire and ghostly claws alike, yet still afloat by stubbornness alone, and the crews that remained upon them shouted encouragement to those on the beach, lowering ropes and planks, hauling men aboard as the sea rose higher, waves smashing against the wrecks, and Elias, with his last strength, lifted one man after another, forcing them onto the fury. Even as water rushed around his boots, and Isolde did the same, her pistol long spent but her dagger flashing against skeletal hands that clawed from the waves, for still the dead would not relent, their hollow eyes fixed on the living, hungry for the warmth of breath, and Finn's absence pressed upon them like a weight, his sacrifice fresh yet already swallowed by the chaos of survival, and Elias wondered if the boy's spirit watched them now, guiding or condemning, and that thought drove him harder, until at last he himself scrambled aboard, dragging Isolde behind him as the planks snapped and the reef vanished beneath the rising tide, and the shadow's fury rocked violently, nearly capsizing as the island groaned one final time and split asunder, its cliffs collapsing inward, swallowed by the sea in a storm of fire, smoke, and boiling water, and the men watched in awe and terror as the land that had cursed them vanished beneath the waves, leaving only a whirlpool of black water that churned and sucked at the remains, dragging wreckage, bones, and screams down into the abyss, and above it all hung the Eternal, its black sails unshaken, drifting across the horizon as if untouched by wind or tide, its burning-eyed figure watching, silent now, patient, as though content to wait for the circle to close again, and when at last the whirlpool stilled, leaving only ripples that spread across the dawnlit sea, the men aboard the Fury and the Ghost slumped to the deck, their bodies shaking, their hearts hollow, for they had lived when so many had died. But they did not feel alive, not truly, for the curse still clung to them like chains, and silence fell save for the creak of timbers and the moan of the sea, and Elias leaned against the rail, his face drawn, his eyes shadowed, staring not at the waves but at Isolde, who stood with her cloak whipping in the wind, her face pale, her lips pressed tight, and he asked her, his voice low, "What now, Isolde? Where do we sail, when the sea itself hunts us?" And she looked at him, her eyes full of secrets and sorrow, and she answered, "We sail where we must, Elias, to the place where my oath was first sworn, to the temple beneath the waves, for only there can the chains be broken, or bound tighter." And the men stirred at her words, muttering among themselves, some fearful, some angry, for they had followed her before in hope of treasure, but now she spoke of temples and oaths, and it sounded more like doom than fortune, and Elias felt their eyes upon him, waiting for him to speak, and he straightened, squaring his shoulders though he ached in every bone, and he said, "We have no choice but to follow, for the sea gives us no choice. If the temple is where this curse began, then let it be where we end it, one way or another." And though some grumbled, they obeyed, for their faith in him was all that held them together, and so the battered ships turned their prows from the ruins of the island and set sail into open waters, though the wind was weak and the sea heavy, and the Eternal still lingered at the edge of the horizon, a shadow that did not fade, a reminder that they were watched, judged, measured with every mile they sailed, and the days that followed blurred together, the sea both ally and enemy, giving fish when hunger gnawed, but tossing storms without warning, breaking masts, tearing sails, and every night the whispers returned, louder, clearer, sometimes speaking in the voices of the men they had lost, sometimes in the voice of Finn, sometimes in voices they did not know, and the men grew restless, muttering of desertion, of mutiny, some begging to turn back though there was nowhere to turn, and Elias fought to hold them together, his words sharp, his gaze fierce, though within he was as broken as they, haunted by dreams of the boy's sacrifice, by the look in Isolde's eyes, by the endless grin of the skull upon the eternal. And one night, as the crimson moon rose again, blood-red across the waves, he stood alone on the quarterdeck, staring at the horizon, and whispered to himself, "How many more must die before the sea is done with me?" And behind him Isolde answered, soft but steady, "As many as it takes, Elias, as many as it takes, unless we end it ourselves." And he turned to her, anger flaring. "And if ending it means your blood, Isolde? If that is the only way, will you give it?" And she met his gaze without flinching, though her hands trembled, and she said, "If it is my fate, I will not run from it, but I will not give myself to the sea easily. I will fight it, as I have always fought, until the last breath leaves me." And her words struck him with both admiration and despair, for he knew she meant them, and he knew too that fate was not so simple. And even as they spoke, the sea whispered, the sails groaned, and the shadows of the eternal crept closer in the night, for the circle was not ended, only widened, and the temple beneath the waves awaited them, with answers that might save or damn them all. And as the shadow's fury creaked onward through seas that seemed to watch with eyes unseen, the days bled into nights and the nights into days, each hour stretching longer than the last, the men worn thin by hunger, storms, and the endless whispers that now haunted even their waking moments, for the voices no longer waited for sleep but spoke through the winds, through the creak of timbers, through the very spray of the sea that stung their faces, sometimes murmuring in soft tones of lost mothers and children, sometimes screaming in the voices of comrades dragged beneath the waves. And each man was tested in his own way, some covering their ears and sobbing, some falling into silence, as if their souls had been stolen, and some lashing out at shadows, blades flashing against empty air, while Elias forced himself to walk the deck with the weight of a commander who could not break, though inside he felt himself unraveling, his thoughts gnawed by guilt, his body weakened by wounds that refused to heal. And in the quiet hours of dawn he would stare at the horizon and wonder if his life was merely a coin tossed by fate, rolling ever closer to its final drop. And Isolde watched him with eyes that burned both with blame and something softer she dared not name, her heart torn between vengeance and the old bond that still lived in the space between their blades when they fought side by side. And every night she dreamed of the priestess, her ancestor, whose voice grew louder with each crimson moon, speaking warnings and riddles of bloodlines, chains, and choices yet to be made, telling her that the temple was not merely a place but a prison of time itself, where oaths carved into stone could bind generations, and she feared what would happen when they reached it. Yet she hid her fear, for the crew would not follow a woman who trembled, so she stood tall, her cloak whipping in the storm winds, her words sharp as steel, and still the eternal followed them, sometimes close, sometimes vanishing into mist only to reappear at dawn, its black sails lit by no wind, its figure still burning-eyed, watching with patience that made the men mutter of devils and gods. And one night a man named Harrow, who had once laughed the loudest and sung the boldest, snapped at last, standing upon the rail, with wild eyes shouting at the sea, "Take me, if you will! Take me and leave the rest!" And before any hand could stop him he leapt into the waves, his screams swallowed by the dark, and the crew fell silent, too weary even to mourn. But the next morning his voice echoed from the hold, whispering to those who dared step below, his laughter turned hollow, and when Elias ordered the hatch sealed, the men obeyed without question, for none wished to hear their dead brother mock them from the shadows, and the journey dragged on. The food dwindling, the sails torn again and again by storms that rose and died without warning, as if the sea itself tested their resolve, and still the map in Isolde's hands glowed faintly, its lines shifting, leading them ever southward, until at last, on a night when the moon rose full and white instead of crimson for the first time in many weeks, the sea grew calm, too calm, the waves flattening into a mirror that reflected the stars so perfectly that the men whispered of sailing the sky itself. And then the water began to glow, faint at first, then brighter, green and gold, like veins of fire beneath the surface, stretching for miles ahead until they formed the shape of a circle vast as an island, and at its center a light burned brighter, deep below, and the men gasped, some falling to their knees, some crossing themselves, for they knew without being told that this was the temple Isolde had spoken of, the drowned temple, waiting beneath the waves, its heart pulsing like a living thing. And Elias stood at the prow, his eyes locked on that glow. His fists tight on the rail, and he whispered to himself. So it begins, while behind him the Eternal drifted closer, silent, patient, a shadow at the edge of the starlit sea, and then the whispers rose again, but this time not in the wind, not in the timbers, but from below the waves, rising through the glow, thousands of voices speaking as one, chanting words that made the men clutch their heads in pain, some collapsing, some bleeding from ears and nose, and Isolde cried out, lifting the map high. And the glowing veins upon it matched the glow below, pulsing in time with the voices, and she screamed above the cacophony. It calls for blood! It always calls for blood! And Elias turned to her, his eyes blazing, and shouted, Then whose blood must it be, Isolde? Yours? Mine? The boy is gone. Will you demand another sacrifice? And she stared at him, tears mixing with the spray on her cheeks, and said, Not demand, Elias. The sea demands, the oath demands, I only bear the burden. And the men, hearing this, grew restless, their fear boiling into rage, for they had followed through hell and now were told of more sacrifice. And a murmur of mutiny rose, blades drawn, voices sharp, some shouting, No more blood for their curse! Let them pay it themselves! And in that instant the fragile line between order and chaos snapped, steel flashed in torchlight, men lunged at one another, some loyal to Elias, some loyal to Isolde, some loyal to none but their own fear, and the deck became a battlefield again, brother against brother, while above the Eternal loomed nearer, its black sails casting shadows that seemed to stretch across the very stars, and Elias fought his own men with sorrow in his heart, parrying blades that once defended him, while Isolde did the same, her voice lost in the storm of screams, and in the chaos a sailor named Bran forced his way to the rail with the map clutched in his hand, stolen from Isolde's grasp, and he shouted, No more curses! No more chains! And he hurled the map into the glowing sea, and for a heartbeat all fell silent, every blade freezing in mid-swing, every cry cut short, as the parchment struck the water and dissolved into light, its glow spreading across the circle until the entire sea blazed, blinding, searing, and from its depths a shape began to rise, vast, ancient, covered in coral and barnacle, stone and gold fused together, a temple not drowned but alive. Its spires stretching higher with every surge of water, until the sea itself seemed to flee from it, waves crashing outward as the drowned temple rose into the night, dripping, groaning, glowing with runes older than any tongue, and the men staggered back, some dropping to their knees in awe, others screaming in terror, while Elias and Isolde stood side by side, their swords lowered, their eyes wide, for they knew that the choice of blood had not been denied but merely delayed. And now the temple itself demanded it, a debt older than the sea, older than the stars, and the Eternal crept closer still, its figure raising a burning hand as if in salute, as if to welcome them to the end of their voyage, and the whispers became one word, shouted across sea and sky. Enter! And the command rattled the men's bones as though the sea itself spoke through their marrow, and the shadow's fury groaned under the weight of the sound, its timbers creaking as if the ship feared to obey. But Elias, gripping the rail with white knuckles, forced his voice above the thunder of that single word and roared, Steady! Steady, damn you! If the sea calls us, we'll answer as sailors, not cowards! And though many still shook, his words planted a spine of iron in some, enough to haul ropes, man the sails, and steer the battered vessel toward the rising temple, while Isolde stood at the bow, her cloak clinging to her in the spray, her face lit by the eerie glow of runes that spiraled across the colossal stone, her lips moving as if in prayer though her eyes betrayed both fear and hunger, for she could feel the oath of her ancestor burning in her blood, drawing her toward those gates of coral and gold as surely as the tide drew the sea to shore. And behind her the men muttered, torn between awe and terror, some whispering that no man should tread upon a place risen from the abyss, others whispering that perhaps within lay riches beyond imagination, treasures guarded for centuries by the drowned dead, yet all were silenced when the Eternal slid into view once more. Closer than it had ever dared, its black sails cutting against the glowing sea like a scar, and upon its deck the burning figure lifted his hand again, and the ghosts that clung to its rigging wailed as one, their hollow eyes fixed upon the temple as though they too awaited judgment. And when the fury drew near, the waters calmed as if in deference, forming a path of green light leading directly to the titanic gates that rose taller than the tallest mast, carved with faces of gods long forgotten. Their mouths twisted into shapes of warning, their eyes weeping streams of glowing water, and the men fell silent, crossing themselves or muttering charms, unwilling to raise their voices in the shadow of such power. And then, with a grinding that shook the very sea, the gates began to open, stone upon stone moving though no hand touched them, until a black passage yawned wide, the glow spilling inward like a river of stars, and the voices whispered again, softer now, beckoning, coaxing. "Enter, enter, your blood will speak, your oath will bind." And Elias turned to his crew, his face hard, his voice steady though his heart thundered, and he said, "We go ashore, every man who dares, follow me, and those who do not, pray for the rest of us." And he leapt down into the shallow glow that lapped at the temple steps, his boots striking stones slick with centuries of silence. And one by one, some with courage, some with fear, the men followed, torches in hand, blades drawn though they knew steel meant little against curses, and Isolde walked beside Elias, her pistol held steady, her eyes never leaving the runes that seemed to pulse with every step she took, as though the temple itself recognized her, claimed her. And the further they went, the heavier the air grew, thick with salt and incense, with the stench of long-dead offerings, and the walls of coral and gold closed around them, etched with carvings of battles and sacrifices, of priests raising obsidian daggers above screaming captives, of seas swallowing fleets whole. And the men shivered, for the carvings moved in the flicker of their torches, mouths opening, eyes shifting, waves rolling across the stone as if the walls themselves remembered. And at the heart of the passage the floor sloped downward until they stood in a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls lined with statues of priests whose eyes glowed faintly, and at the center stood an altar of black stone, upon which lay a basin filled with water that glowed the same green light as the runes, rippling though no breast stirred it, and above it hung chains of gold so heavy they looked like roots of a tree, anchoring something beneath the stone, something that pulsed as though alive. And the whispers rose louder, no longer vague but clear, speaking in tongues each man understood in his own language, though the meaning was the same. "Blood opens, blood binds, blood pays." And Elias stepped forward, his sword still in hand, though its weight felt useless, and he said, his voice echoing in the chamber, "What price do you demand? Who must bleed this time?" And the water in the basin shimmered, rising into a shape, a figure of shifting light that wore the mask of a jaguar, the same that had appeared on the island, and its voice boomed like thunder, shaking dust from the ceiling. "The chain was forged by blood, and only by blood may it be broken. 2 lines, bound by oath and betrayal, must pay what was stolen." And at those words all eyes turned to Elias and Isolde, for none doubted who the 2 lines were, his betrayal of her oath of her bloodline, their sins entwined by fate. And a murmur rose among the men, some crying out that it was just, others shouting in anger that they would not bleed for the sins of their captains. And again steel flashed as arguments turned to blows, men desperate to place blame, desperate to escape the price. But Elias silenced them with a roar, his voice cracking but fierce. "Enough! If it is us the sea wants, then let it take us, but it will not have you." And Isolde turned to him, fury and sorrow burning in her eyes, and hissed, "You would give yourself so easily? You would let the sea write the end without a fight?" And he stepped closer, his face inches from hers, his voice low. "I would end it, Isolde, I would end the circle that has stolen everything. If my blood is the price, I'll pay it." And she shook her head, tears bright in the torchlight, and whispered, "And what of me, Elias? Do you think I would let you bear it alone? Do you think the sea will let either of us go without the other?" And as their words clashed like blades, Finn's voice echoed suddenly in the chamber, though the boy was gone, his sacrifice swallowed by the sea, yet his voice rang clear from the glowing water. "The choice is not yours alone, Captain. The chain binds all, the sea remembers all. And the price is greater than you know." And the men cried out in terror, some fleeing toward the passage, though the shadows swallowed them, their screams cut short, and those who remained clutched their blades tighter, looking to Elias, to Isolde, to the basin that shimmered with Finn's ghostly reflection, and the temple trembled as though impatient, the chains rattling above, the altar groaning, and the jaguar mask's voice thundered once more. "Choose now, or the sea will choose for you, and all shall drown in its hunger." And those words slammed against the walls of the chamber until the very stones seemed to quake with the weight of them. and the crew shrank back, some clutching their ears, some falling to their knees in prayer, some glaring at Elias and Isolde with eyes full of blame. And Elias stood still, his chest heaving, his sword lowered, his mind racing with every memory of the boy Finn, of his lost crewmen, of nights haunted by whispers that carried the names of those he had betrayed, and he felt the truth in the words. The sea wanted him, had always wanted him, and yet when he glanced at Isolde, standing tall though her hands shook, her eyes blazing with fury and sorrow, he knew that the chains were not his alone, that her oath and his betrayal had been woven together like the rope that bound ships to docks, and to cut one strand meant nothing unless all were cut, and the basin rippled again, Finn's ghostly image forming clearer now. His young face pale, his eyes hollow with sacrifice, and his voice, softer than before, spoke not to Elias but to Isolde. "You know, Lady Blackwood, what your bloodline swore. You know the curse that your ancestor bound with dagger and prayer. You cannot escape it, no more than I escaped my fate, and still you hide the truth from them." And the crew turned to her, their voices rising in a wave of suspicion and anger, some shouting, "What truth? What oath?" while others brandished blades, torn between striking her down and begging her for answers. And Isolde raised her hand, commanding silence, though her own voice trembled when she spoke. "It is true. I am bound by the blood of my kin, by the priestess who forged the curse centuries ago, binding the artifact to the sea, binding all who sought it to endless torment, and I have carried that weight in silence, for to speak it was to awaken the chain, to call the temple from the deep, to bring this night upon us, yet fate has brought it all the same, and now we stand where my ancestor once stood, at the altar of choice, and the sea demands payment." And her words cut through the chamber like knives, the men shouting in rage, in despair, in horror, for some spat curses at her name while others wept, believing themselves doomed, and Elias stepped between her and their blades, his voice fierce though cracked. "You would cut her down now, after following her through hell? You would spill her blood for your fear? The sea demands a price, aye, but it will not be paid with cowardice, it will be paid by those strong enough to face it." And he turned his gaze upon the basin, upon the glowing water that still reflected Finn's hollow face, and said, "If it must be me, then let it be." But before he could step forward, Isolde seized his arm, her grip like iron, and hissed, "No, Elias, not alone, never alone. If you think to give yourself, then I give myself too, for this curse has claimed us both, and I will not let you bear it without me." And the jaguar mask's voice thundered again, louder, hungrier. "Two lions bound, two bloods joined. Only through sacrifice together can the chain be broken." And the men gasped, realizing the truth, that Elias and Isolde both must bleed, and a ripple of panic surged through them, for some believed their captain's death would free them, while others believed it would damn them further, and fights broke out again, steel clashing, men grappling, shouts echoing, until the chamber rang with chaos. But over it all rose another sound, the groan of stone, the grind of chains, the tremble of the temple itself, as though the sea grew impatient, as though the very walls would collapse if the demand were not met. And Elias raised his sword high, its steel gleaming in the glow, and shouted above the storm of voices, "Enough! If this is to be done, it is done by our hands, not by the seas." And he lowered the blade toward the basin, its tip hovering above the glowing water, while Isolde drew her dagger, obsidian etched with the same runes that glowed on the walls, and together they stood, side by side, ready to strike. But then the water surged, forming not Finn this time but another figure, taller, broader, clad in tattered Spanish armor, a conquistador whose face burned with fury, the same figure who had haunted the island's shore, and his voice bellowed like thunder. "No! You shall not break what I forged! This temple is mine, this curse is mine, and I guard it until the stars themselves fall from the sky." And the men staggered back as the ghostly captain strode from the basin, dragging chains of glowing gold, his sword of flame raised, his eyes fixed on Elias, and the eternal shadow fell across the chamber, its black sails blotting the light as the burning-eyed figure upon its deck finally stepped ashore, his form no longer distant but clear, a towering wraith wrapped in shadow, his hand a torch of fire, his voice like the roar of the sea itself. "The circle closes, the temple shall not free you, it shall bind you forever." And in that moment, as the conquistador ghost and the Eternal's master advanced, the chamber shook with power, the statues of priests along the walls stirring, their stone eyes flaring with light, their mouths opening in chants of death, and the crew, half mad with fear, charged into battle once more, steel flashing against flame and shadow, torches falling. The air filled with screams, and in the center of it all stood Elias and Isolde, their blades raised, their blood demanded, their fate at hand, knowing that only by their choice, or their fall, could the sea's hunger be answered. And as the Eternal's master stepped closer, fire dripping from his skeletal hands, the chamber darkened, every torch dimming, every flame bending toward him as though the air itself was sucked into his presence. And the conquistador ghost snarled, raising his burning sword, but even he faltered at the sight of this new figure, for though both were bound to the artifact, the Eternal's master radiated something far greater, a hunger not just for treasure or vengeance but for dominion over the sea, over the living, over time itself. And the crew, broken and bloodied, shrank back, their courage fraying, their whispers turning into panicked cries, some swearing to flee, others swearing to fight, and some dropping to their knees begging for mercy. Yet mercy was a thing the sea had long since forgotten, and as shadows crawled along the temple walls, the jaguar mask boomed again, its stone lips moving though no hand touched it. The chain is stretched to breaking, the sea calls, the curse stirs, but the choice remains, blood freely given or blood stolen, sacrifice in unity or in chaos, choose! And the words thundered like cannons, and Elias's mind raced, his heart hammering in his chest, for he saw in the flames around the Eternal's master the faces of every soul he had lost, men swallowed by storms, men betrayed for gold, men whose eyes had followed him into sleep, and they whispered in unison, "Captain Thorn, the sea takes back what it lent, the wheel turns, and your debt is due." And for a moment his sword felt like an anchor too heavy to hold, his knees buckling, until he felt Isolde at his side, her presence steady, her dagger glowing faintly with the runes of her ancestor, and her voice, sharp yet trembling, whispered, "Do not bow. Elias, not now, not to them, we are not theirs, not yet." And in her words he found a spark, enough to steady himself, enough to raise his blade once more, and the Eternal's master, hearing her defiance, laughed, the sound a hollow roar that shook the walls, and he said, "Not theirs? You are mine, both of you, bound before your bloodlines even drew breath, your sins and oaths tied to the same stone, and you will fall as all have fallen before." And he raised his hand, sending a wave of shadow like a tidal surge across the chamber, men screaming as it passed through them, stealing their strength, aging their bodies in moments, turning skin to bone, bone to dust, until only echoes remained, and yet Elias and Isolde stood firm, the wave breaking against them though their flesh burned with its touch, and the conquistador roared, charging forward, his burning sword clashing with the shadow fire of the Eternal's master, sparks and screams filling the air as the two ghostly titans fought, their strikes cracking stone, their fury tearing chunks from the ceiling, and the crew scattered, some grabbing fallen weapons to strike at the shadow, though their blades passed harmlessly through, others trying to flee into the tunnels only to find them blocked by walls of water that surged up like living things, trapping them within. And among them a sailor named Briggs, scarred and weary, clutched the wooden charm his mother had given him years ago, praying to gods he no longer believed in, and as he prayed, the charm glowed faintly, its symbol matching those on the walls, and he realized that perhaps the curse did not bind only Elias and Isolde but all of them, every soul dragged into this night, and he shouted above the chaos, "Captain? The chain ain't just you, it's us all, every one of us bound." But his voice was lost in the roar, and Elias, locked in his own storm, barely heard, his mind torn between the call of the basin, demanding his blood, and the call of the blade, demanding he fight, and Finn's ghost appeared once more at the water's edge, his young voice urgent. "Elias! Isolde! Listen, the ritual is not only blood, it is fire, it is choice, it is truth. You must give not what the sea demands but what it fears, only then can you break it." And his figure flickered, his form straining as if the sea itself tried to silence him, but his words clung to Elias's mind like a lantern in fog, and Isolde, hearing them too, glanced at the dagger in her hand, its obsidian edge sharper than thought, its runes pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat, and she felt her ancestor's voice again whispering, "You swore to bind, but you may also sever, if you dare pay the price." And she raised the dagger high, her cloak whipping around her in the storm of shadows, and shouted, "Enough! This ends tonight, with our hands, not theirs!" And she slashed the air, the dagger cutting through shadow like cloth, a tear opening in the chamber's darkness, revealing for an instant the sea beyond, raging, endless, hungry. And the Eternal's master staggered, his laughter breaking into a snarl, his flame guttering, while the conquistador seized the moment, driving his sword of fire deep into the wraith's chest, their clash exploding in a wave of heat and light that hurled men across the room. Stone shattering, the basin boiling, and through it all Elias and Isolde stood, blood running from their wounds, fire in their eyes, knowing that the true moment had come, the moment to give or to take, to bind or to break. And as the temple groaned, chains snapping, statues falling, the jaguar mask cried out one last time, its voice both plea and command. "Choose now, or drown forever!" And the sea answered with a roar, waves crashing through cracks in the walls, flooding the chamber, dragging men screaming into the depths, while the Eternal's master rose again, burned but unbroken, his fiery eyes blazing, his skeletal hand reaching for Elias's throat, and Elias, gasping, bleeding, yet unyielding, raised his sword one final time, not to strike the wraith but to turn the blade toward his own chest, ready to spill the blood the sea demanded, while Isolde screamed and lifted her dagger to join him, and together their voices rang out, not in fear but in defiance. "If the sea must have us, it takes us together!" And the chamber erupted in light, brighter than dawn, fiercer than flame, as their choice bound fate itself. And when the light began to fade, it did not vanish at once but lingered, shimmering like waves at sunrise, a glow that painted the cracked stone walls with colors no human eye had seen before, and for a moment, all was silent, the roar of the sea muted, the clash of blades stilled, even the Eternal's master frozen mid-snarl, his fiery eyes flickering uncertainly as though the very fabric of his existence trembled under the weight of what Elias and Isolde had done, and the conquistador ghost, half burned and half flame, staggered back from his foe, his sword dissolving into sparks as his face twisted between rage and awe, and the crew, scattered across the flooded floor, groaned and stirred, their bodies bruised and broken but their eyes wide, staring at their captains who stood in the center of the basin's light. Elias bleeding from his chest where his blade had almost pierced him, Isolde clutching the obsidian dagger that still glowed faintly with the pulse of her ancestors' bloodline, and though they had not yet fallen, it was clear the sea had taken something from them, some piece of their strength, some measure of their souls, for their faces were pale, their voices hoarse, and yet their eyes burned brighter than ever, and the jaguar mask, now cracked and crumbling, spoke one last time in a voice softer than before. The chain bends, but is not yet broken." And with those words it shattered, stone fragments falling into the rising flood, and a great groan tore through the temple as if the island itself was waking from centuries of slumber, the walls splitting, water pouring in from unseen cracks, and the crew screamed as the floor tilted, dragging men into the rushing tide, and Elias roared for them to grab ropes, to climb the broken statues, to cling to anything that still held above the water. His voice, carrying the authority of a captain who would not let his men die without a fight, but deep inside he feared that no command could save them from what was coming, and above, through the cracks in the ceiling, flashes of lightning illuminated the sky, showing the shadow of the Eternal looming larger, its black sails spread wide, its hull impossibly tall, as if it had grown with the storm, as if the very sea had crowned it king. And upon its deck the figure of fire and shadow, the Eternal's master, staggered but unbroken, let out a scream that shook the heavens, a scream of fury, of pain, of hunger, and with one flaming hand he reached down, stretching through the broken roof of the temple as though distance meant nothing, his burning fingers curling toward Elias and Isolde, and though the light of their sacrifice repelled him for a moment, his strength was not fully spent, and he pressed forward, each step shaking the sea, each breath turning the air to ash, and the conquistador ghost, though weakened, dragged himself forward too, shouting in a voice torn between loyalty and defiance, "You will not claim them! You will not!" And he hurled himself at the Eternal's master again, their clash sending fresh waves of fire and shadow across the chamber, striking down sailors where they stood, and in that chaos, Briggs, the scarred sailor who had prayed to his charm, crawled through the flood toward Elias, clutching the glowing wooden trinket in his fist, and shouted over the roar, "Captain? This charm, it's part of it, part of the binding. My mother said our blood was tied to the priestess's line, said our family served her long before the Spaniards came, and now I see it's true. The curse ain't just on you and her, it's on all of us who came here. We're all links in the chain, and maybe together we can break it." And Elias, panting, his vision blurring, forced himself to meet Briggs's eyes, seeing not a desperate sailor but a man standing on the edge of destiny, and he nodded. Grasping the charm with his free hand, feeling its warmth join with the dagger's glow, the basin's shimmer, the very heartbeat of the temple, and Isolde, hearing this, realized that the curse had never belonged to her family alone, that the priestess had bound it to the sea itself, and all who sailed those waters were caught in its net, and for the first time in years, she felt not the weight of carrying the curse alone but the strange, fragile hope that perhaps together they could shift it, if not end it. And as the temple cracked wider, the flood rose higher, men cried out, some calling prayers to gods, some cursing the captains, some striking at the ghosts that still swarmed from the shadows, skeletal hands dragging at their boots, hollow eyes staring with endless hunger. And in the midst of it Finn's ghost appeared again, stronger than before, standing not in the basin but upon the collapsing floor. His face calm though his eyes were sad, and he said, "You are close, but not yet. There, the choice was made, but the sea still clings. It will not let go unless you show it what it has never known, not fear, not greed, not hunger, but something greater, something it cannot consume." And though his words were riddles, Elias felt the truth of them, and when he looked at Isolde he knew what Finn meant, for in her eyes he saw not the enemy she had once been, not the rival who had hunted him across oceans, but the woman he had loved and lost, the bond they had buried beneath ambition and vengeance. And though the sea had taken everything from him, it had not taken that spark, and he realized that perhaps the sea feared love more than any sword, for love was the one tide it could not command, and with trembling voice he whispered to Isolde, "If love is the price, then let it be our gift." And she, though tears cut through the grime on her cheeks, nodded, her dagger lowering, her free hand reaching for his, and in that touch the chamber seemed to still, even as stone cracked and water rushed, for their choice was not blood, not steel, but the surrender of hatred, the binding of hearts, and the light that surged from them was not like before, not the harsh blaze of sacrifice but the steady glow of dawn, spreading warmth across the chamber, pushing back the shadows, dimming the fire of the Eternal's master, softening the rage of the conquistador ghost, and the crew, seeing it, felt strength return to their limbs, felt fear weaken in their hearts, some even dropping their weapons as if realizing that steel alone could not win this battle, and the sea itself, roaring through the cracks, faltered for the briefest instant, its waves hesitating, its hunger uncertain. And that hesitation was enough for the temple to shift again, stone trembling, chains breaking, as if the curse itself was deciding whether to release or tighten, and above, the Eternal's master howled in fury, his fiery eyes blazing brighter, his skeletal form swelling larger, as if he would tear the island apart before surrendering, and his voice, deeper than thunder, bellowed, "You think love can unmake what was forged in fire and blood? Then drown in it!" And he hurled himself downward, a pillar of flame and shadow crashing through the broken roof, striking the basin, exploding the chamber into a storm of water, fire, stone, and screams, and as all was swallowed in chaos, Elias and Isolde clung to one another, their hands bound not by rope or curse but by choice, and together they faced the wave. Their fate yet unwritten as the sea demanded its final due dot, and when the wall of fire and water slammed into them it was as if the whole world had cracked open, the chambers shattering with deafening roars, the floor splitting into jagged ridges, the statues of the ancient priest-kings tumbling one by one into the flood, their stone faces vanishing beneath black waves, and men screamed as they were hurled into the water, some vanishing instantly, others clawing for broken beams, while cannonballs and chains rolled loose across the tilting floor, striking sailors down like toys. And through it all Elias clutched Isolde's hand, refusing to release her even as the water tried to wrench them apart. Their bodies slammed against the walls, dragged under, thrown up again in choking sprays, until they broke the surface gasping, coughing salt and blood, and found themselves clinging to what remained of the basin, now cracked and half submerged, its glow still pulsing faintly beneath the swirling flood, and within that light Finn's ghost reappeared. His young form flickering but steadier than before, as if the chaos gave him strength, and his voice rose above the roar. "The storm is not the end. It is the door. The sea takes but also opens, and only those who carry truth in their hearts can pass. And though his riddle was as strange as ever, Elias felt something shift inside him, a faint clarity like a compass needle finding north, and he shouted over the thunder to his soul. We must not only fight to live, we must walk through it. And she nodded, though her eyes were wide with fear, for above them the Eternal's master towered, his flaming body half inside the chamber, half rooted to the monstrous ship that loomed through the storm, and his roar shook the very bones of the island, his fiery arms sweeping across the chamber like a scythe, striking down men where they clung, setting wood aflame even as it floated in the water, and the conquistador ghost, though fading, still threw himself at the wraith, his burning sword clashing again and again, buying only moments but refusing to yield, and Briggs, clutching his charm, dragged 2 sailors from the flood onto a broken statue, shouting to them that they must hold fast, that the captain had a plan, though in truth he did not know what plan Elias had, only that faith was all they had left, and more voices rose as men called out to their lost families, to forgotten gods, to the sea itself, pleading for mercy that never came, and then the floor gave way entirely, the last stones crumbling, plunging them into a whirlpool that spun with the fury of 1,000 storms, dragging them down into the earth, deeper and deeper the world, reduced to black water and choking foam, and in that descent Elias thought he would drown, his lungs burning, his limbs weakening, until he felt Isolde's hand still locked in his, and that small warmth gave him strength to keep kicking, keep fighting, and then suddenly there was light, faint at first, then brighter, until they burst out into an enormous cavern below the temple, a hollow space carved by the sea itself, its walls glowing with the same runes that had lined the basin, the air thick with mist and salt, and in the center rose a massive stone arch, half buried in coral and bone, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift as they stared, and beyond it shimmered a curtain of water that did not fall but hung in place like a living mirror, showing flashes of stars, of endless seas, of worlds beyond, and Finn's voice echoed again, though they could not see him now, only hear his words in the rushing tide. This is the gate of tides, the heart of the chain, the door between the world of men and the sea eternal. Here all who are bound must choose, to cross and surrender, or to stand and sever. And as his words faded, the Eternal's master descended into the cavern, his body dripping with fire and shadow, his form so immense he filled the ceiling, his flaming eyes fixed on Elias and Isolde, and he hissed, "This gate is mine! No soul passes but through my hand, no chain breaks but by my will!" And with him came a tide of ghosts, hundreds of them, pirates and sailors, soldiers and slaves, all who had ever been claimed by the curse, their hollow eyes glowing, their skeletal hands clutching rusted swords, spears, chains, their whispers filling the cavern like 1,000 storms, and the crew of the Shadow's fury, broken but unbowed, drew what weapons remained, clinging to driftwood, broken spars, even bones, and Elias raised his sword, its blade dented and salt-eaten but still steady in his grip, and shouted with the last strength in his lungs, "Then we stand here, together, as men, as women, as sailors of the living sea, and if this is to be our doom, we meet it with open eyes." And his men roared in answer, their courage lit by his words, though death loomed close, and Isolde lifted her dagger, the runes glowing brighter than before, as though the gate itself answered her presence, and she cried, "This curse ends tonight." And with that the cavern erupted into battle once more, steel and shadow clashing, fire and water colliding, the gate pulsing brighter as if feeding on their struggle, and in the chaos Briggs's charm shattered in his hand, releasing a wave of light that shielded him and those beside him, and he realized with horror and awe that his family's oath had tied him to this very moment, that his blood too was part of the price, and he shouted to Elias, "Captain, it's not just you. It's us all. We all must bleed or all must love, the chain won't break for one." And though Elias barely heard through the screams, he felt the truth in the air, in the water, in his own pounding heart, that this was not a burden for one man or one woman alone but for every soul bound to the sea, and the gate of tides shimmered brighter, its surface rippling like a heartbeat, waiting, demanding, calling them to a choice greater than any blade could make, and above them the Eternal's master screamed again, his fire raging, his shadow stretching, his skeletal hand reaching, determined to crush them before they could step through. And the cavern shuddered as though it too feared his wrath, great chunks of coral and stone falling from the ceiling into the rising flood, waves crashing against the walls with such force that men were thrown from their footing, their cries lost in the roar, and the gate of tides pulsed brighter, each shimmer rippling through the water and across their skin like the beat of a giant heart, and within that shifting curtain of water they saw visions, glimpses of other seas calm and endless, some lit by gentle moons, others storming with lightning yet strangely beautiful, glimpses of ships long forgotten sailing under banners no man recognized, glimpses of faces of those they had loved and lost, beckoning silently as if calling them home, and the crew froze at these sights, torn between terror and longing, some dropping their weapons to reach for the gate, others clutching tighter to steal in fear it was but another trick of the sea, and Elias, his sword raised, saw among the visions his first ship, the Maiden's Grace, sailing golden at dawn with every man alive again, laughing, singing, their faces unscarred by betrayal or storm, and his chest ached with such longing he nearly fell to his knees, but Isolde's voice cut through the haze, sharp and fierce. "Do not believe the pictures, Elias, they are bait, nothing more, the sea shows what we crave so we step blind into its jaws." And he blinked hard, shaking off the lure, his grip tightening on his blade, for he knew she was right, that the sea never gave without taking thrice as much, and around them the ghosts wailed, their hollow voices rising in a chorus that shook the very bones of those who still lived, the skeletal horde pressing closer, swinging rusted blades that bit with cold more painful than steel, their hands clutching with hunger for warmth, and men screamed as they were dragged down, their souls seeming to unravel as the specters tore through them, and still the sailors of the Shadow's fury fought back, their courage born not of hope of victory but of loyalty to their captain, their blades flashing in the glow of the runes, their roars echoing through the cavern like thunder, and Briggs, though bloodied, lifted a broken spar and fought beside them, his heart hammering with the knowledge that his bloodline's oath had tied him to this doom. And he shouted to all who could hear, "Stand with them! Stand with the captains! If we bleed as one, or we drown alone!" And some heard his words, their courage steadied, while others drowned in despair, their cries fading into the flood, and above it all the Eternal's master pressed forward, his shadow hand stretching across the cavern, sweeping away men like ants, his fiery roar cracking stone, and the conquistador ghosts, though fading fast, still struck again, his burning sword a streak of light, crying in rage and pride, "I forged this curse with greed and I die breaking it with fury!" And he plunged his blade into the wraith's chest once more, though it burned him to ash, his scream lost as his form crumbled into dust that scattered across the flood, and for the briefest instant the Eternal's master staggered, his flames faltering, and in that instant Elias roared for his men to press forward, to push toward the gate, though none knew if crossing meant freedom or doom, only that standing still meant death. And as they struggled forward Isolde raised her obsidian dagger, its runes blazing now so bright they lit the whole cavern, and she cried, "Ancestors of my blood, hear me now! I do not bind, I do not curse, I sever, I release!" And she slashed the air, a wave of light bursting forth, cutting through the ghosts in a blinding arc, their forms dissolving into mist, their screams fading into silence, and for a heartbeat the cavern was clearer, the living no longer drowned beneath the swarm, and Elias turned to her, awe and pride mixing in his eyes, though sorrow too, for he saw the toll it took on her hand shaking, blood dripping from her nose, her strength waning, and he shouted, "Do not carry it all, Isolde, this is ours to bear together!" And he gripped his sword tighter, its edge cracked and broken, and with a roar he plunged it into the stone floor, the runes flaring as though answering his will, and from the ground surged a light like a pillar, meeting Isolde's dagger, binding their powers, binding their choices. The glow filling the cavern so fiercely the ghosts shrieked and recoiled, and even the Eternal's master faltered, his flaming hand retracting for the first time, his roar shaking with anger but also something like fear, and he hissed, "You think you know the chain, but you do not. The sea does not break, it consumes, and I am its hand." And he spread his arms wide, his fire expanding, shadows flooding the cavern, his form swelling until he seemed as vast as the gate itself, his burning skull leering down at them, and the crew fell back in terror, their courage snapping like brittle wood. But Elias stood firm, Isolde at his side, Briggs clutching what remained of his shattered charm, the sailors rallying around them, and Finn's voice rose once more from the gate, calm even as the storm raged. "The sea is strong. But stronger still is the bond freely given. Only if all hearts speak as one can the chain be broken. Only if love greater than fear fills the tide will the gate open to freedom. And with those words every man and woman in the cavern felt the truth in their bones, and they faced the choice not of swords but of souls, whether to give themselves to greed and rage, or to bind themselves together as one. And as the Eternal's master surged forward for the final strike, Elias lifted his voice, raw and fierce, crying, "Then speak, all of you, speak with me!" And he shouted into the storm, "We are not yours, see, we are not chains, we are free!" And his men roared it back, their voices trembling but strong, and even those at the edge of despair found the strength to cry it too, their words echoing in the cavern, a wave of defiance louder than the sea's roar, and Isolde's dagger blazed, the runes singing, and the gate of tides pulsed brighter, trembling, as if waiting for the final word.